In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where countless species have risen and fallen, where empires span solar systems, and technology defies the laws of physics as ancient civilizations once knew them, there exists one universal truth that binds all sentient life together: fear. Every species, no matter how advanced, how peaceful, or how enlightened, carries within their genetic memory the echo of ancient terrors. The Zephyrians fear the crushing depths of water due to their aerial evolution. The Christek tremble at the thought of biological contamination, their silicon-based forms vulnerable to organic pathogens. The mighty Corvin Empire, conquerors of 17 star systems, still shudder at the mention of the void-spawn nightmares that once hunted their ancestors in the dark between worlds. But what happens when a species arrives that seems to have no such primal fears? What occurs when beings appear who not only lack these ancestral terrors, but actively seek out and embrace the very things that send other species into panic? What becomes of a natural order when creatures emerge who treat the galaxy's most feared predators as pets? The Galactic Academy's Xenobiology Course 347 was about to discover that humans don't just lack fear. They collect it, nurture it, and somehow transform the universe's greatest horrors into something far more dangerous than any nightmare: companions. This is the story of the day an entire class learned that in a galaxy full of monsters, the most terrifying thing might just be the species that befriends them all. The crystalline corridors of Nexus Station hummed with the soft vibration of 1,000 different life support systems, each one calibrated to maintain the precise atmospheric requirements of the Galactic Academy's diverse student body. Professor Kelthra's 4 eyes swept across the lecture hall, taking note of the familiar faces that had returned for another semester of advanced xenobiology. The Altarian twins floated in their gravity-dampened seats, their translucent forms shimmering with nervous energy. Behind them, a young Corvin cadet sat rigidly upright, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the soft bioluminescent lighting. Scattered throughout the amphitheater-style classroom were representatives from dozens of species, each one a testament to the incredible diversity that the Galactic Confederation had achieved over the past 3 centuries. But today, Professor Kelthra's attention was drawn to the single empty seat in the front row. According to her roster, they would be joined by their first human student, a species that had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel and had been admitted to the Academy on a probationary basis. The academic board had been divided on whether to allow the newcomers into advanced courses, given their limited exposure to galactic civilization, but Kelthra had argued passionately for inclusion. After all, how could they learn if they weren't given the opportunity? The professor's contemplation was interrupted by a soft chime indicating that someone was requesting entry. The classroom's bioscanner hummed briefly before the door iris dilated open, revealing a figure that immediately drew every eye in the room. The human was smaller than most of the other students, standing barely 2 meters tall, with a peculiar bipedal stance that their species had evolved. What struck Kelthra most was the creature's apparent lack of any obvious defensive modifications. No natural armor, no protective coloration, no visible weapons or deterrent features. The human skin was a warm brown color, covered partially by what appeared to be simple fabric garments, and topped with a mass of dark, curly hair. "Sorry I'm late, Professor," the human said, their voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent classroom. "I got a bit turned around in the station's passages. I'm Marcus Chun, the new exchange student from Earth." Kelthra's translator implant processed the human's words with only a slight delay, though she noticed that several of her students seemed to be having more difficulty. The human language patterns were unlike anything in the standard galactic databases, filled with subtle inflections and implied meanings that didn't translate well through standard neural interfaces. "Welcome, Marcus," Kelthra replied, gesturing toward the empty seat with one of her secondary arms. "Please, take your place. We were just about to begin today's practical examination." As Marcus made his way down the stepped aisle, Kelthra observed the reactions of her other students. The Zephyrians had instinctively moved away from the windows, their fear of enclosed spaces triggered by the human's solid, dense appearance. The Christek representative had activated his contamination shield, a faint energy field that sparkled around his silicon-based form. Most telling of all, the Corvin cadet's battle sense organs had begun to emit the low-frequency hum that indicated a perceived threat, though the young warrior seemed puzzled by his own reaction. "Now then," Kelthera continued once Marcus had settled into his seat. Today we'll be conducting practical assessments of predator recognition and appropriate defensive responses. As advanced students, you should be familiar with the theoretical frameworks we've discussed regarding survival instincts across different species. Today, we put that knowledge to the test. She moved to the center of the classroom, where a large containment field generator sat dormant on the presentation platform. With practiced efficiency, she began inputting commands into the device's control interface. Each species that has achieved space flight has done so by overcoming significant environmental challenges. In almost every case, this has involved developing sophisticated threat detection and avoidance mechanisms. Today, we'll explore how these mechanisms manifest when confronted with unfamiliar but genuinely dangerous predators. The containment field shimmered to life, creating a transparent barrier roughly 3 meters square. Kelthera continued her explanation while making final adjustments to the device. The exercise is simple. I will project a holographic representation of a predator species from the galactic database. Your task is to identify the threat level and describe the appropriate survival response based on your species' natural instincts. Remember, we're not looking for learned responses. We want to understand how your evolution has programmed you to react to danger. A nervous ripple passed through the classroom. The Altarian twins began to emit a high-pitched harmonic that their species used for stress relief. The Christech students' contamination shield grew brighter, while the Corvin cadets' warning hum increased in volume and frequency. Let's begin with something relatively mild, Kelthera announced, activating the first hologram. Within the containment field, a creature materialized that resembled a cross between a giant spider and a serpent, with 8 articulated legs supporting a sinuous body that ended in a head filled with rows of crystalline teeth. The professor watched as her students reacted according to their programming. The Zephyrians immediately began a complex aerial display, rising from their seats and spinning in tight circles, a behavior intended to confuse predators that hunted by tracking linear movement. The Altarians' harmonic pitch shifted to a frequency that would theoretically shatter the nerve clusters of silicon-based predators, while their forms began to pulse with warning bioluminescence. The Christech student's response was the most dramatic, as his entire body began to undergo rapid crystallization, transforming from a mobile form into a static, diamond-hard defensive structure. But it was Marcus's reaction that captured Kelthera's full attention. The human leaned forward in his seat, apparently studying the creature with intense curiosity rather than fear. His heart rate, which Kelthera was monitoring through the classroom's standard biometric sensors, had actually decreased rather than spiked. Most remarkably, the human appeared to be smiling. Interesting choice for a first example. Marcus commented when the hologram faded and the other students had returned to their normal states. The morphology suggests an ambush predator, probably evolved in a low-gravity environment given the leg structure. I'm guessing it's from a world with significant vertical terrain features, maybe cliff faces or large tree analogs. The classroom fell into stunned silence. Kelthera's translator implant processed the words, but she found herself questioning whether the device was functioning correctly. The human had just provided a detailed analytical assessment of a creature that had triggered every possible fear response in her other students. "You weren't afraid?" asked Silex, one of the Altarian twins, his voice still carrying harmonics of distress. "Afraid?" Marcus looked genuinely puzzled. "Why would I be afraid? It's just a projection, right? And even if it were real, it's contained. Besides, it's fascinating. Look at the way those leg joints articulate. That's millions of years of evolutionary refinement right there. And those teeth, they're not just for killing, they're probably used for precision work too. Maybe nest building or mate selection displays." Kelthera found herself struggling to process this response. In all her years of teaching, she had never encountered a student who reacted to predator stimuli with academic curiosity rather than instinctive fear. "Marcus," she said carefully, "are you certain you understand the nature of this exercise? This creature is not merely dangerous. It's specifically designed to trigger deep-rooted survival instincts. The morphology you're admiring represents millions of years of evolutionary pressure to become the perfect killer." "Oh, I get that," Marcus replied cheerfully. "But that's what makes it so cool, isn't it? I mean, look at the efficiency of the design. Every aspect of its body plan is optimized for its ecological niche. It's like a master craftsman's work, but created by natural selection instead of intelligent design. The Corvin cadet, whose battle sense organs had finally stopped their warning hum, spoke up with obvious bewilderment. But how does your species survive if you don't fear predators? How did you achieve space flight if you never learned to avoid danger? Marcus considered this question seriously, his expression thoughtful. Well, I guess we do fear some things. But we tend to fear different stuff than you guys, apparently. And when we encounter something dangerous, our first instinct isn't usually to run away or hide. It's to figure out how it works, how to predict its behavior, maybe even how to work with it or around it. Work with predators? Silex's twin, Rylex, seemed unable to comprehend this concept. But predators exist to kill and consume other life forms. How does one work with a creature whose evolutionary purpose is to end your existence? Oh, that's easy, Marcus said with the enthusiasm of someone discussing a favorite hobby. You just have to understand what they want and find a way to give it to them without getting hurt. Back on Earth, we've got tons of examples. Take dogs. Their ancestors were pack hunters that could easily kill a human. But we figured out that they valued social connection and reliable food sources more than the thrill of the hunt. So we gave them those things, and they became our partners instead of our predators. The concept seemed to break something fundamental in several students' understanding of the universe. The Christak student's contamination shield flickered as his concentration wavered. The Corvin cadet's exoskeleton plates shifted restlessly, a sign of deep cognitive dissonance. You're saying, Professor Kelthera said slowly, that your species actively seeks to form partnerships with creatures that evolve to hunt you? Sure, all the time. Cats, horses, birds of prey, even some of the big predators like wolves and bears. Oh, and there are loads of examples where we've figured out how to work alongside creatures that other animals avoid. Spiders, snakes, sharks. Humans have found ways to coexist with or even benefit from relationships with pretty much every type of predator you can imagine. The professor realized that this conversation was moving far beyond her planned curriculum, but the educational value was too great to ignore. Can you give us a specific example? Something that might help my other students understand this concept. Marcus nodded eagerly. Okay, perfect example, bees. Bees are technically predators, right? They got natural weapons, they're aggressive about defending their territory, and they can definitely kill you if you're not careful. Most animals stay far away from bee nests because getting stung is a potentially fatal experience. A sensible response, the Corvin cadet commented approvingly. Except humans figured out that bees aren't really interested in fighting. They just want to protect their honey and their larvae. So instead of avoiding them, we learned to approach them calmly, use smoke to keep them docile, and work with them to harvest honey without destroying their nests. The bees get protection and care, we get honey and help with crop pollination. Everybody wins. But surely this required extensive protective equipment? Professor Kelthera asked. Specialized armor or defensive technologies? Nah, mostly just a mesh suit and some basic tools. The key is understanding their behavior patterns and respecting their needs. If you approach a beehive during their active season, move slowly, and don't make them feel threatened, they'll pretty much ignore you. The dangerous predator becomes a cooperative partner. The silence that followed this explanation stretched on for nearly a full minute. Finally, Rylex spoke up with a voice that carried undertones of awe and terror. Your species deliberately approaches armed creatures and attempts to negotiate with them? Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of crazy, Marcus admitted with a laugh. But yeah, that's basically what we do. It's not always successful, obviously, and sometimes people get hurt. But the potential benefits usually make it worth the risk. Professor Kelthera realized that she needed to fundamentally reassess her lesson plan. The humans' responses were so far outside the normal parameters of biological behavior that she was beginning to question whether her standard curriculum was even relevant to this new species. Marcus, she said, I'm going to try a different approach. Instead of showing you creatures that should trigger your fear responses, I'd like you to describe something that your species genuinely fears. Something that makes humans want to flee or hide or defend themselves. The human considered this request seriously, his brow furrowing in concentration. That's actually a really good question. I mean, we definitely have things we're afraid of, but they're probably not what you'd expect. Please enlighten us. Well, most humans are terrified of social rejection, like being excluded from their group or community. That's probably our strongest fear response, actually. We also tend to be really afraid of things we can't understand or predict, like diseases we can't see or cure, or natural disasters that seem random and uncontrollable. The Zephyrians exchanged confused glances. But these are not predators, one of them observed. How can abstract concepts generate the same physiological responses as immediate physical threats? I think that's exactly the point, Marcus replied thoughtfully. Our evolution took a really different path than yours. Instead of developing better physical defenses or faster escape responses, we got really good at social cooperation and problem solving. So our fear responses evolved to protect those abilities rather than our individual bodies. This explanation seemed to resonate more with the students, though Kelthra could see that they were still struggling to fully grasp the implications. The idea of a species that feared social isolation more than physical death was almost incomprehensible to creatures whose survival strategies were based on individual defensive capabilities. Let me try one more demonstration, the professor announced, returning to her control interface. This time, I'll show you something that should trigger universal fear responses, a creature so fundamentally hostile to life that no species has ever been able to coexist with it. The hologram that materialized in the containment field was unlike anything that had appeared before. It was roughly humanoid in basic shape, but wrong in every possible detail. Its surface seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it, creating an absence that hurt to look at directly. The creature's limbs moved in ways that defied basic principles of anatomy, bending and stretching as if bone and muscle were merely suggestions. Most disturbing of all, the thing seemed to be partially phased out of normal space-time, flickering in and out of visibility in a rhythm that made observers feel as if reality itself was becoming unstable. The response from the class was immediate and visceral. Every student, regardless of species, reacted with pure, primal terror. The Zephyrians began shrieking in harmonics that shattered several pieces of equipment. The Altarians collapsed into defensive spheres, their bioluminescence strobing in distress patterns that hadn't been seen for millennia. The Christek student's entire body underwent emergency crystallization so rapidly that hairline fractures appeared in his structure. Even the Corvin cadet, trained from birth for warfare, began clicking his mandibles in the rapid patterns that indicated a call for immediate evacuation. But Marcus was leaning forward again, his expression one of intense fascination. "Professor," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the chaos of terrified students. "What is this thing? The morphology is incredible. It looks like it exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. And the way it's affecting local space-time, is this thing actually real, or is it some kind of theoretical construct?" Professor Kelthra was so shocked by this response that she almost forgot to deactivate the hologram. When the nightmare creature finally faded from view, the other students remained in their defensive states for several long minutes, slowly returning to normal function. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely controlled. That was a shadow wraith. They're creatures from the dark matter realm that occasionally breach into normal space. They're responsible for the disappearance of 17 entire star systems. No known weapon can harm them. No known defense can stop them. And every sentient species in the galaxy shares an instinctive terror of their presence. They represent existential annihilation, the complete cessation of ordered reality. Wow. Marcus breathed, clearly impressed. That's amazing. How do they interface with normal matter? And why do they seem to be only partially visible? Are we seeing them in some kind of dimensional cross-section? The classroom fell silent once again, but this time the silence carried a different quality. It was the silence of minds struggling to process something that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and survival. Finally, the Corvin cadet spoke, his voice carrying the formal cadences of military protocol, but with an underlying note of something that might have been respect. "Human Marcus, does your species possess some form of natural immunity to fear-based psychological warfare?" "Not immunity, exactly," Marcus replied, considering the question carefully. "But I guess we process fear differently than you guys do. When we encounter something scary, our first response is usually to try to understand it. We figure that if we can learn how something works, we can probably find a way to deal with it. Even if dealing with it results in your death?" Professor Kelthra asked. "Well, yeah, sometimes. But even then, we usually try to learn something that might help other humans later. We're really big on sharing information, especially about dangerous stuff. As the class period drew to a close, Professor Kelthra realized that she had learned far more than her student had. The human approach to fear and danger represented something genuinely new in her experience. A species that had evolved not to avoid threats, but to understand and ultimately master them. I believe, she announced to the class, that we may need to revise some of our basic assumptions about survival strategies and evolutionary psychology. Marcus, would you be willing to participate in additional research sessions? I think the scientific community would benefit greatly from a more thorough understanding of human psychological mechanisms. Absolutely, Marcus replied with enthusiasm. This has been the most interesting class I've attended since I got to the station. When can we do more? As the students filed out of the classroom, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed, Professor Kelthra began to understand that the human presence at the academy would represent far more than just another species to study. These beings might fundamentally change how the galactic community understood the relationship between intelligence and survival. And deep in her mind, a small voice wondered whether the shadow wraiths might have good reason to fear a species that looked at existential annihilation and asked how it worked. 73 days after the incident with the shadow wraith hologram, Professor Kelthra found herself standing in the Academy's Xenobiology Research Wing, reviewing the emergency protocols for the 5th time that morning. The field trip she had planned for today had seemed routine when she'd submitted the paperwork weeks ago. A standard visit to the Galactic Preservation Facility to observe contained specimens of dangerous predator species. But that was before Marcus Chun had demonstrated that human fear responses operated on completely different principles than anything previously documented in galactic psychology. The research facility was located in the lower sections of Nexus Station, where additional layers of hull plating and energy shields provided extra security against containment failures. It housed specimens of the most dangerous creatures known to galactic science, maintained in carefully controlled environments for study and preservation. Each containment unit was equipped with multiple fail-safes, emergency lockdown procedures, and enough firepower to sterilize entire sections if necessary. Marcus arrived early, as had become his custom, carrying what appeared to be a primitive data recording device of human manufacture. His enthusiasm was infectious, though Kelthra noticed that the other students seemed to be maintaining a respectful distance from their human classmate. Word of the previous day's demonstration had spread throughout the student body, and reactions ranged from nervous curiosity to outright avoidance. "Professor," Marcus said as he approached, "I've been reading up on the facilities database, and I have to say, you guys have assembled an incredible collection. Some of these creatures represent evolutionary lineages that go back millions of years. The preservation work you're doing here is remarkable." Kelthra felt a familiar mixture of pride and concern. The human's genuine appreciation for their scientific efforts was gratifying, but his casual attitude toward creatures that had prompted her to file emergency evacuation plans was deeply unsettling. "Marcus, before we begin today's tour, I need to ensure that you understand the serious nature of what we'll be observing. These are not holographic projections or theoretical constructs. These are living creatures, each one capable of killing everyone in this room if containment were to fail. I need your assurance that you will follow all safety protocols without question." "Of course, Professor. I wouldn't want to endanger anyone or compromise the research you're doing here." Marcus paused, then added with characteristic curiosity, "Though I have to ask, have you ever had any actual containment failures? I'm wondering how these creatures adapt to artificial environments and whether captivity affects their natural behaviors." Before Kelthra could respond, the rest of the class began to arrive. The Altarian twins floated close together, their usual bioluminescent patterns muted with anxiety. The Christek student had activated a low-level contamination shield that created a faint halo around his crystalline form. Most notably, the Corvin cadet wore full ceremonial armor, an unusual choice that suggested he was taking the potential dangers very seriously indeed. Dr. Vorthak, the facility's chief researcher, greeted them at the entrance to the containment levels. He was a hegemony species, roughly 2.5 meters tall, with the kind of natural armor plating that suggested his ancestors had survived in extremely hostile environments. His greeting was professional but brief, and Kelthra noticed that his attention kept drifting to Marcus with obvious confusion. Before we proceed, Dr. Vorthak announced, each student must acknowledge that they understand the emergency protocols. He gestured to a display panel that showed evacuation routes, emergency communication frequencies, and the locations of emergency shelters throughout the facility. In the event of a containment breach, you are to proceed immediately to the nearest designated safe zone and await extraction by security teams. Under no circumstances should you attempt to observe, interact with, or study any escape specimens. The students acknowledged their understanding with the appropriate responses for their species. Harmonic confirmations from the Altarians, crystalline resonance from the Christek student, and a formal military salute from the Corvin cadet. Marcus simply nodded and said, "Understood, Dr. Vorthak." Safety first. Their first stop was the facility's pride and joy, a containment unit housing a mature void stalker, one of only 3 such specimens in captivity anywhere in the galaxy. The creature was enormous, easily 4 meters at the shoulder, with a body that seemed to be composed of living shadow wrapped around a framework of gleaming metal bones. Its movements were absolutely silent, and it had the unsettling ability to appear and disappear within its containment field without any visible means of locomotion. The Void Stalker, Dr. Vorthak explained, represents one of the apex predators of the deep space environment. They're capable of surviving in hard vacuum, can phase shift to avoid most forms of detection, and possess electromagnetic pulse capabilities that can disable starship systems from a distance of several kilometers. The class observed the creature through multiple layers of reinforced transparent aluminum, each one capable of withstanding direct hits from military-grade plasma weapons. Even with these protections, Kelthra could see that her students were struggling with their instinctive responses. The Zephyrians had unconsciously moved as far from the viewing window as possible, while the Corvin cadet's armor had automatically activated its threat detection systems. But Marcus had pressed himself against the viewing window, apparently trying to get the best possible view of the creature. "This is incredible," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Look at the way it moves. It's not actually teleporting, is it? I think it's manipulating local space-time to create shortcuts through higher dimensional space. And those metallic structures aren't just bones. There's some kind of exotic matter framework that allows it to interface with quantum fields." Dr. Vorthak's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine surprise. "That's actually a remarkably sophisticated analysis. How did you reach those conclusions?" "Well, if you watch the pattern of its movements, you can see that it's not randomly appearing and disappearing. There's a logic to it. It's following some kind of optimized path through space that we can't perceive directly. And the electromagnetic effects you mentioned wouldn't be possible with conventional biology. There has to be some kind of advanced material science involved." "You're correct on all counts," Dr. Vorthak admitted, his tone carrying notes of respect that hadn't been there before. "Most graduate students require several weeks of intensive study to reach similar conclusions. As they moved deeper into the facility, the pattern repeated itself. Each new specimen prompted terror responses from the galactic students and excited curiosity from Marcus. The plasma worm, whose superheated body temperature could melt through starship hull plating, fascinated him with its thermal regulation mechanisms. The phase spider, whose ability to exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously had driven entire research teams to madness, prompted him to ask detailed questions about quantum consciousness and parallel reality interfaces. It was when they reached the facility's most secure section that things began to take an unexpected turn. Here, behind layers of containment fields that required authorization from 3 separate galactic governments to activate, resided a creature so dangerous that even its name was classified. Dr. Vorthak referred to it only as Specimen Zero. "This containment unit represents the absolute limit of our security capabilities," Dr. Vorthak explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The creature inside has been responsible for the complete sterilization of 4 star systems before we were able to contain it. It exists in a state of constant sensory deprivation to prevent it from becoming active." The viewing chamber was different from the others they had visited. Instead of transparent walls, it featured only a small observation portal equipped with multiple filters and dampening fields. Through this limited window, they could see what appeared to be an empty containment cell filled with swirling energy patterns. "Where is it?" asked Rylex, one of the Altarian twins. "It's there," Dr. Vorthak replied grimly. The energy patterns you're seeing are the result of its interaction with the containment fields. The creature itself exists partially outside of normal space-time, which is why direct observation is so limited. Marcus had positioned himself at the observation portal and was studying the energy patterns with intense concentration. After several minutes of silence, he spoke up with a tone of voice that Kelthra had never heard from him before, cautious and almost reverent. Dr. Vorthak, he said slowly, I don't think this creature is malevolent. I think it's in pain. The statement hit the group like a physical blow. Dr. Vorthak's armor plating visibly shifted as his stress responses activated. Impossible. This creature has destroyed billions of lives. It's a force of pure destruction. No, look at the energy patterns, Marcus insisted, gesturing toward the observation portal. They're not chaotic or aggressive. They're like someone crying. The frequency modulations, the way the intensity peaks and fades, this looks like a distress signal. Marcus, Professor Kelthra said urgently, please step away from the observation window. Your assessment may be colored by human perceptual biases. But Marcus remained where he was, continuing to study the creature through the filters. Professor, what if this thing isn't trying to destroy star systems? What if it's trying to communicate, and the destruction is just a side effect of its attempts to reach out? Dr. Vorthak's expression had gone from surprise to alarm. Even if that were true, which I strongly doubt, it doesn't change the fact that contact with this creature results in total annihilation. Intent is irrelevant when the result is the same. But intent is everything, Marcus replied, turning away from the observation portal to face the group. If it's trying to communicate, then there might be a way to establish meaningful contact without triggering the destructive effects. We just need to understand what it's trying to say and find a way to respond that doesn't involve direct interaction. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected sound, a soft chime from the containment unit's monitoring system. Dr. Vorthak immediately moved to a nearby control panel, his movements quick and efficient. That's unusual, he muttered, reviewing the readouts. Specimen Zero's activity levels have increased significantly in the last few minutes. But it's not showing aggressive patterns. It's showing curiosity patterns. Curiosity patterns? Professor Kelthra asked. Energy signatures that we've observed when it first encounters new stimuli. But there haven't been any changes to its environment that should trigger such a response. Dr. Vorthak paused, then looked directly at Marcus. Unless it's responding to your presence. The implications of this statement sent ripples of unease through the group. The possibility that Specimen Zero could detect and respond to observers despite multiple layers of containment had never been considered. Maybe I should try something, Marcus suggested, moving back toward the observation portal. Absolutely not, Dr. Vorthak said firmly. Any interaction with Specimen Zero requires approval from the Galactic Security Council and backup from 3 separate fleets. But before anyone could stop him, Marcus had placed his hand against the observation portal's outer surface and was speaking in a low, gentle voice. Hey there. I know you probably can't understand me, but I wanted to let you know that someone recognizes that you're in pain. I'm sorry that we can't help right now, but we're trying to learn. We're not your enemies. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The energy patterns within the containment cell shifted from the chaotic swirls they had been displaying to something that looked almost like organized waveforms. For a brief moment, the patterns seemed to pulse in rhythm with Marcus's heartbeat. Then the alarms began. Emergency lights bathed the observation chamber in pulsing red illumination as automated systems throughout the facility activated. Dr. Vorthak was frantically working at multiple control panels, trying to understand what was happening. All containment fields are holding, he reported, though his voice carried notes of panic. But Specimen Zero's energy output has increased by 300%. We're reading quantum fluctuations that shouldn't be possible within the containment matrix. Is it trying to escape? The Corvin cadet asked, his armor's weapon systems automatically charging. No, Dr. Vorthak replied, his voice filled with bewilderment. It's trying to reshape the containment field? The patterns suggest it's attempting to create some kind of communication interface. Marcus was still standing at the observation portal, apparently oblivious to the chaos erupting around him. I think it's trying to show us something, he said, his voice calm despite the sirens and flashing lights. Look at the patterns. They're not random. It's creating geometric structures, mathematical relationships. This is language. Professor Kelthera realized that they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. Specimen Zero, the creature responsible for more destruction than any force in recorded history, was attempting to communicate. And it was doing so in response to a human's recognition of its emotional state. Dr. Vorthak, she said, her voice carrying the authority of her academic position. I need you to contact the Xenolinguistics department immediately. We need specialists here now. Professor, Dr. Vorthak replied, protocol requires me to initiate full lockdown procedures. We should evacuate the facility and no. The voice that interrupted him was Marcus's, but it carried a tone of absolute certainty that none of them had heard before. If we leave now, we'll lose this opportunity. Look at what it's doing. It's creating a stable communication matrix despite being contained. This is first contact with a truly alien intelligence, and it's happening because someone finally recognized that it isn't a monster. It's a person. The energy patterns within the containment cell had stabilized into complex geometric forms that shifted and evolved in clearly deliberate patterns. Even through the multiple layers of containment and filtering, it was obvious that they were observing something that transcended random energy discharge. Marcus is correct, Professor Kelthera announced, making a decision that would change her career forever. This is no longer a containment situation. This is a diplomatic contact scenario. Dr. Vorthak, please implement first contact protocols and contact the Academy's Xenodiplomacy Department. As the facility's staff rushed to accommodate this unprecedented situation, Marcus remained at the observation portal, apparently holding a wordless conversation with one of the galaxy's greatest terrors. And for the first time in recorded history, Specimen Zero was demonstrating behavior patterns that suggested hope rather than rage. Professor, Marcus said softly, not taking his eyes away from the observation portal, I think we're going to need to completely rethink our assumptions about predator-prey relationships. This thing isn't a predator at all. I think it's been trying to find friends for a very long time. Professor Kelthera realized that Marcus was probably right, and that this revelation would send shockwaves throughout galactic civilization. The most feared creature in known space wasn't a monster, it was just lonely. The emergency conference room aboard Nexus Station had been designed to accommodate representatives from every major species in the Galactic Confederation, but it had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. Around the curved table sat some of the most powerful figures in galactic government. Admiral Corax of the Hegemony Fleet, Director Synthesis of the Christek Collective, High Scholar Luminera representing the Altarian Council, and a dozen other officials whose decisions affected billions of lives across hundreds of star systems. At the center of all this political power sat Marcus Chun, looking remarkably calm for someone who had just triggered the largest diplomatic crisis in galactic history. Professor Kelthera had spent the past 6 hours in emergency briefings, trying to explain to increasingly incredulous officials how a single human student had managed to establish communication with Specimen Zero. The creature that had been responsible for the destruction of 4 star systems was now generating complex mathematical patterns in apparent response to human emotional recognition, and nobody in galactic leadership had any idea how to proceed. Let me ensure that I understand the situation correctly, Admiral Corax said, his voice carrying the harsh harmonics of barely controlled aggression. A first-year student with no diplomatic training, no xenobiological expertise, and no official authority has initiated first contact with the most dangerous entity in known space. With respect, Admiral, Professor Kelthera replied, Marcus has demonstrated remarkable intuitive understanding of xenobiological psychology. His insights have proven more accurate than decades of conventional research. His insights have created a security crisis. Director Synthesis interjected, their crystalline form resonating with stress patterns. Specimen Zero's increased activity has triggered alert conditions in 17 star systems. Our containment projections indicate that if its energy output continues to increase at current rates, the containment matrix will fail within 72 hours. Marcus looked up from the data tablet he had been studying. Actually, I don't think the containment will fail. I think Specimen Zero is trying to show us how to improve it. Look at the energy patterns it's generating. They're not chaotic forces trying to break free. They're engineering schematics. The statement sent a ripple of disbelief around the conference table. High Scholar Luminera, whose species had pioneered much of the galaxy's containment technology, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. Mr. Chun, containment field technology represents millions of years of development across dozens of species. The mathematics alone requires specialized neural modifications to comprehend. What makes you think you can interpret engineering data from a creature that exists partially outside normal space-time? Because it's not just showing me engineering data, Marcus replied patiently. It's showing me how it experiences the containment system. From its perspective, our containment fields aren't prison walls, they're noise. Chaotic interference that makes it impossible for it to communicate clearly. The patterns it's generating aren't attempts to escape, they're suggestions for modifications that would reduce the interference while maintaining the security. Even if that were true, Admiral Korax said, we cannot risk weakening containment protocols based on the suggestions of the creature we're trying to contain. The logical inconsistency should be obvious. Should it? Marcus asked, genuinely curious. I mean, if you wanted to design a prison cell that was both secure and humane, wouldn't you want input from the person who was going to live in it? Specimen 0 has been in containment for what? 50 years. It probably understands the system better than any of us do. Dr. Vorthak, who had been monitoring Specimen 0's condition throughout the emergency meetings, spoke up from his position at a mobile monitoring station. Mr. Chun raises a valid point. Our analysis of the creature's recent pattern changes suggests that it has, indeed, developed a sophisticated understanding of our containment technology. The modifications it appears to be suggesting would theoretically improve both security and efficiency. Theoretically, Director Synthesis emphasized, we cannot stake galactic security on theoretical improvements suggested by a creature that has destroyed 4-star systems. But that's exactly my point, Marcus said, his voice taking on the passionate tone that Professor Kelthera had learned to recognize. What if those star systems weren't destroyed deliberately? What if Specimen 0 was trying to establish communication, and the destruction was an accident caused by incompatible communication methods? The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of galactic history. The destruction of 4-star systems represented the loss of billions of lives and had shaped interstellar policy for decades. The possibility that this catastrophe had been an unintended side effect of attempted communication was almost too significant to consider. Mr. Chun, High Scholar Luminera, said carefully, you're suggesting that we've been containing and studying what we thought was a mindless force of destruction, when in reality, it was an intelligent entity attempting to establish diplomatic contact. I'm suggesting that we consider the possibility, yes. Look, I know it sounds crazy, but think about it from Specimen 0's perspective. It manifests in normal space-time near inhabited systems, probably drawn by electromagnetic signatures that indicate intelligent life. It tries to communicate using the only methods available to it, massive energy manipulations that create detectable patterns across interstellar distances. But to species that don't understand what it's trying to do, these communications look like attacks. Admiral Korax's armor plates shifted in patterns that indicated deep thought. If this hypothesis were correct, it would mean that our containment of Specimen 0 has prevented further accidental destructions. But it would also mean that we've been holding a sapient entity in sensory isolation for 50 years, which would be considered a violation of the Sapient Rights Accords. Director Synthesis pointed out their crystalline structure taking on hues that suggested legal concern. If Specimen 0 is proven to be a sapient entity, our current containment methods would constitute imprisonment without trial and torture through sensory deprivation. The political implications were staggering. The Galactic Confederation's entire legal and ethical framework was based on the recognition of sapient rights across all species. If Specimen 0 was reclassified as a sapient entity rather than a dangerous creature, it would trigger the largest legal crisis in galactic history. There's only one way to determine the truth, Professor Kelthera announced, making a decision that she knew would define the rest of her career. We need to allow Marcus to attempt formal communication with Specimen 0 under control conditions. Absolutely not, Admiral Korax said immediately. The security risks are unacceptable. With respect, Admiral, Marcus interjected, the security risks of not trying are probably worse. If Specimen 0 really is trying to communicate, and we continue to ignore its attempts, it might eventually find ways to break containment on its own. But if we can establish meaningful contact, we might be able to negotiate a solution that works for everyone. Negotiate. Director Synthesis seemed genuinely confused by the concept. What could we possibly offer a creature of such power? The same thing we'd offer any sapient being, Marcus replied simply. Recognition, respect, and the opportunity to find its place in galactic society. Dr. Vorthak looked up from his monitoring station with an expression of surprise. Specimen Zero's energy patterns just shifted again. It's generating what appears to be mathematical representations of various star system configurations. But they're not random. They correspond to the locations of the systems it was detected in before the destructions occurred. It's trying to tell us something about those incidents. Marcus realized, his eyes lighting up with understanding. Can you display the patterns on the main screen? The conference room's primary display activated, showing complex three-dimensional models of stellar arrangements. As they watched, Specimen Zero's energy patterns reshaped themselves into representations of star systems, complete with planetary orbits and electromagnetic field mappings. These are incredibly detailed. High Scholar Luminera observed, her analytical mind overcoming her initial skepticism. The creature is demonstrating knowledge of astronomical mechanics that exceeds most graduate-level students. And look at this, Marcus said, pointing to specific elements within the display patterns. These energy signatures here, they correspond to the electromagnetic emissions from advanced civilizations. Specimen Zero is showing us that it was specifically drawn to inhabited systems, which supports your hypothesis that it was attempting to establish contact, Professor Kelthra noted. The patterns shifted again, this time showing what appeared to be communication attempts. Energy pulses emanating from Specimen Zero's position toward the inhabited worlds, followed by representations of the catastrophic energy releases that had destroyed the systems. It's showing us what happened. Marcus breathed, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and sadness. It tried to send messages, but the energy levels required to communicate across interstellar distances were too high. The communications themselves caused the destructions. Director Synthesis's crystalline structure took on patterns that suggested deep contemplation. If this interpretation is correct, then Specimen Zero has been attempting to confess its accidental crimes and express remorse for the destructions it caused. More than that, Marcus replied, studying the continuing patterns. I think it's been trying to figure out how to communicate safely. Look at these newer patterns. They're showing different energy levels, different modulation techniques. It's been working on the problem for 50 years, trying to find a way to talk to us without accidentally killing us. The weight of this revelation settled over the conference room like a heavy blanket. The galaxy's greatest monster was actually a remorseful entity that had spent half a century in isolation, trying to solve the problem of how to apologize for accidents it had never intended to cause. Admiral Corax, Professor Kelthra said formally, I request permission to implement a modified containment protocol that would allow for limited communication attempts with Specimen Zero under full security supervision. Admiral Corax was silent for a long moment, his armor plates cycling through patterns that indicated intense internal debate. Finally, he spoke with the measured tones of a military commander making a decision that could affect galactic history. Permission granted with the following conditions. All communication attempts will be conducted under maximum security protocols with full fleet backup standing by. Any sign of aggressive behavior or containment compromise will result in immediate implementation of termination procedures. And Mr. Chun will be equipped with emergency extraction capabilities at all times. Thank you, Admiral, Marcus said, apparently unfazed by the mention of termination procedures. I think you're making the right choice. I sincerely hope so, Mr. Chun, Admiral Corax replied grimly. Because if you're wrong about Specimen Zero's intentions, the consequences could be catastrophic. As the officials began to disperse to make preparations for the most unprecedented first contact attempt in galactic history, Marcus remained at the conference table, studying the continuing patterns that Specimen Zero was generating. Professor Kelthra noticed that the human's expression carried none of the fear or uncertainty that she would have expected from someone about to attempt communication with such a dangerous entity. Marcus, she said quietly, aren't you afraid of what might happen? Marcus looked up at her with the kind of smile that she was beginning to recognize as uniquely human, equal parts confidence and curiosity. Professor, I'm about to have a conversation with a being that exists partially outside of space-time and has enough power to reshape star systems. How could I be anything but excited? Professor Kelthra realized that she was beginning to understand something fundamental about human psychology. They didn't just lack the fear responses that governed other species. They had evolved something far more dangerous: the ability to transform fear into fascination, and the compulsion to reach out to the unknown rather than flee from it. In less than 12 hours, Marcus Chun would attempt to hold the first formal conversation between the Galactic Confederation and its greatest nightmare. And the humans seemed to think this was the most wonderful opportunity imaginable. The modified observation chamber bore little resemblance to the sterile research facility it had been 24 hours earlier. Teams of engineers from 17 different species had worked through the night, implementing Specimen Zero's suggested modifications to the containment system while maintaining full security protocols. The result was a communication interface unlike anything previously conceived: a blend of Altarian harmonic resonators, Christek quantum field manipulators, and Corvin electromagnetic dampeners, all coordinated through a complex control matrix that even its designers weren't entirely sure they understood. Marcus stood at the center of it all, wearing a specialized environmental suit that had been hastily assembled from the best protection technology available. The suit incorporated emergency teleportation systems, quantum phase shifters, and enough computational power to analyze and respond to energy patterns in real time. Despite all these precautions, everyone in the facility understood that if Specimen Zero decided to become hostile, no amount of protection would be sufficient. Final systems check complete, Dr. Vorthak announced from his position at the primary control station. All containment fields are stable, communication interfaces are online, and emergency protocols are standing by. Around the modified observation chamber, representatives from every major species watched through heavily shielded viewing ports. Professor Kelthera observed from the primary monitoring station, her 4 eyes tracking dozens of different readouts simultaneously. Admiral Korax commanded the operation from a tactical center that had been established in an adjacent chamber, with direct communication links to 3 separate fleet squadrons positioned at strategic points throughout the system. Specimen Zero's activity levels have been increasing steadily since the modifications were completed, Dr. Vorthak reported. Energy patterns indicate what appears to be excitement or anticipation. It knows we're getting ready to talk to it, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the communication system. I think it's been waiting for this opportunity for a very long time. High Scholar Luminara's voice came through the interchamber communication system. Mr. Chun, remember that we have no precedent for this type of contact. The creature's responses may be completely unlike anything we can predict or prepare for. I understand, Marcus replied, moving toward the primary communication interface. But that's what makes it so amazing. We're about to have a conversation with a form of intelligence that's completely outside our experience. This is the most important moment in galactic history. The primary interface was a complex array of energy field generators and harmonic resonators designed to translate human speech and thought patterns into forms that Specimen Zero could perceive and potentially understand. In theory, it should also be capable of translating Specimen Zero's energy patterns back into forms that human cognition could process. In practice, nobody was entirely certain what would happen when it was activated. Beginning first contact attempt, Marcus announced, placing his hands on the interface control surfaces. Specimen Zero, can you perceive me? The response was immediate and dramatic. The energy patterns within the containment chamber shifted from their usual chaotic swirls to something that resembled organized waveforms. Through the communication interface, these patterns were translated into sounds that the human ear could process, a complex harmonic tone that seemed to carry emotional content as well as information. Contact established, Dr. Vorthak reported, his voice filled with awe. The creature is responding to Mr. Chen's communications with organized energy patterns. Translation algorithms are functioning within expected parameters. Marcus smiled, apparently unbothered by the fact that he was having a conversation with an entity that could unmake star systems. Hello there. My name is Marcus. I'm sorry that it's taken us so long to figure out how to talk to you properly. The response came as a series of harmonic tones that the translation system rendered as something resembling speech, though the voice was unlike anything in galactic databases, simultaneously vast and intimate, ancient and curious. Hello, Marcus. I have been hoping to meet someone who could hear me. I have been very lonely. The simple statement sent shockwaves through the observation chambers. After decades of speculation about Specimen Zero's motivations and intentions, its first words to galactic civilization were an expression of loneliness. "We're sorry about that," Marcus replied, his voice gentle. "We didn't understand that you were trying to communicate. We thought you were trying to hurt people." "I did hurt people," Specimen Zero replied, its translated voice carrying tones of profound sadness. "When I first tried to speak to your kind, I did not understand that my words were too strong. I destroyed the homes of many beings before I learned that I must be more careful." Professor Kelthra felt her worldview shifting as she listened to this exchange. The galaxy's greatest terror was expressing remorse for accidental destruction, demonstrating emotional sophistication that exceeded many supposedly advanced species. "Can you tell us about yourself?" Marcus asked. "We'd like to understand who you are and where you come from." The energy patterns within the containment chamber shifted to new configurations as Specimen Zero formulated its response. "I come from spaces between your spaces where matter is thin and time moves differently. My kind are few, and we have watched the small bright points where thinking beings gather. We hope to share knowledge and friendship, but our nature makes such sharing dangerous." "Your kind?" Marcus asked with obvious interest. "There are others like you?" "Few remain. Most have chosen to stay in the deep places where they cannot accidentally harm the small bright beings. But I wanted to meet your kind, to learn from you, and perhaps to teach. I have studied your patterns from afar, and I believe there's much we could share if we could find safe ways to speak." Admiral Korax's voice came through the communication system with careful military precision. "Specimen Zero, why did you not retreat when your initial contact attempts resulted in destruction?" The creature's response carried tones of embarrassment and determination. "I was young then, and thought that if I just tried harder, I could learn to speak softly enough not to cause harm. By the time I understood that I needed help to communicate safely, your people had surrounded me with barriers and placed me in this quiet place. I learned to appreciate the safety of containment, but I never stopped hoping that someone would recognize that I was trying to communicate." "And now?" Professor Kelthra asked, unable to resist joining the conversation. "What do you hope to accomplish through communication with our species?" "I hope to learn," Specimen Zero replied simply. "Your kind thinks in ways that fascinate me. You build structures that persist across time. You form connections across vast distances. You find ways to make the impossible become possible. I have watched civilizations rise and fall across the galaxy, but yours is different. You adapt, you grow, you reach out to the unknown instead of fleeing from it." Marcus laughed, a sound that seemed to please Specimen Zero if the brightening energy patterns were any indication. "You're talking about humans specifically, aren't you? The other species here are much more sensible than we are." "Perhaps, but your lack of sensible fear is what makes communication possible. When the others of your kind look upon me, they see only danger and destruction. When you look upon me, you see possibility." Director Synthesis joined the conversation from their monitoring station. "Specimen Zero, if we were to release you from containment, would you be able to avoid accidentally destroying inhabited systems?" The pause that followed was filled with complex energy patterns as Specimen Zero, apparently, considered the question carefully. "With the communication methods we have just established, yes. I believe I could learn to speak softly enough to visit your worlds without causing harm. But I would need guidance, and I would need to practice in places far from inhabited systems until I'm certain of my control." "What would you want to do if you were free?" Marcus asked. "I would like to travel, to meet different kinds of thinking beings, to learn about the ways you have solved the challenges of existence. I would like to share knowledge about the deep places and the things that exist between stars. And perhaps I would like to help protect the small, bright places where life gathers, for there are dangers in the deep that your kind has not yet encountered." The implications of this statement sent ripples of unease through the observation chambers. The idea that there were threats in deep space, even more dangerous than Specimen Zero, had never been seriously considered. "What kind of dangers?" Admiral Korax asked, his military instincts fully engaged. "Things that consume light itself. Entities that exist only to unmake ordered reality. Forces that turn stars cold and empty. My kind have always served as guardians against such threats, but we are few and growing fewer. Perhaps, if your kind could learn to work with beings like me, the small bright places would be safer." Marcus was practically glowing with excitement. "You're talking about a partnership." Specimen Zero, Are you suggesting that your species could work together with galactic civilization to protect inhabited systems from deep space threats? I am suggesting that isolation serves no one. Your kind has shown me that it is possible to communicate across the barriers that separate different forms of life. Perhaps it is time to end the loneliness on both sides. The conversation continued for hours, touching on everything from the fundamental nature of reality to the practical challenges of interspecies cooperation. Specimen Zero demonstrated knowledge of physics and engineering that exceeded galactic civilization's understanding, while also expressing a childlike curiosity about concepts that other species took for granted. Family structures, artistic expression, the way different beings found meaning in finite existence. As the formal contact session drew to a close, Professor Kelthra realized that they had accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. They had not only established communication with an entity of vast power and alien intelligence, but had discovered that it was fundamentally benevolent. A protector rather than a destroyer, a teacher rather than a conqueror. Specimen Zero, Marcus said as the final communication preparations began. Before we end today's conversation, is there anything you'd like to say to the people who have been studying and containing you all these years? The entity's response came as a complex harmony of tones that carried gratitude, forgiveness, and hope in equal measure. Thank you for keeping me safe while I learn to be careful. Thank you for finally listening when I try to speak. And thank you for showing me that the small, bright places are filled with beings who, like me, reach out toward what they do not understand rather than flee from it. As the communication interfaces powered down and the various monitoring systems recorded the end of formal first contact, Admiral Korax made an announcement that would reshape galactic policy for generations to come. By joint authority of the Galactic Council and the Military Command, I am authorizing the reclassification of Specimen Zero as a sapient entity under the designation Ambassador Zero. Preparations will begin immediately for establishing formal diplomatic relations and developing protocols for eventual release under appropriate supervision. Marcus removed his helmet and looked around the observation chamber with the kind of satisfaction that comes from a job well done. You know, Professor, he said to Kelthra, I think this is the beginning of a really beautiful friendship. Outside the facility, in a vast emptiness between stars, other entities similar to Ambassador Zero felt the first successful communication across the species barrier. For the first time in millions of years, the guardians of the deep places began to consider the possibility that they might not have to protect the small, bright places alone. The galaxy had just become a much larger and more wonderful place. 6 months after first contact with Ambassador Zero, Nexus Station had been transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. The first multi-species diplomatic facility designed to accommodate beings that existed partially outside normal space-time. The station's new deep space communication wing featured specialized chambers that could interface with entities whose very presence warped local reality. Translation matrices capable of rendering conceptual frameworks that had no analogs in conventional language, and containment systems that functioned more like comfortable meeting rooms than prison cells. Marcus Chun stood in the central observation deck, watching through reinforced viewing ports as Ambassador Zero demonstrated advanced stellar engineering techniques to a gathering of the galaxy's top astrophysicists. The entity that had once been feared as Specimen Zero now served as both teacher and protector, sharing knowledge that was revolutionizing galactic science while coordinating with long-range patrol fleets to monitor for deep space threats. It's remarkable how quickly the scientific community adapted to working with Ambassador Zero, Professor Kelthra observed, joining Marcus at the observation deck. 6 months ago, the idea of collaborative research with an entity of such power would have been unthinkable. People are pretty adaptable when they realize they're dealing with someone who genuinely wants to help. Marcus replied, watching as Ambassador Zero used controlled energy manipulations to demonstrate how stellar magnetic fields could be adjusted to extend a star's lifespan. Besides, it helps that Ambassador Zero is probably the most patient teacher I've ever encountered. Through the communication interface, they could hear Ambassador Zero explaining complex astrophysical concepts with the kind of enthusiasm that Marcus had come to associate with beings who genuinely loved sharing knowledge. The entity had proven to be not just willing to teach, but eager to learn, asking questions about galactic civilization that often led to insights that benefited everyone involved. Marcus, Professor Kelthera said, her tone carrying notes of academic curiosity. I've been reviewing the reports from your other interactions with previously classified dangerous species. The pattern that's emerging is unprecedented. Over the past few months, Marcus had somehow become the galaxy's unofficial specialist in dangerous entity communication. When the research station on Kepler 442b had reported unusual behavior from their contained void stalker, Marcus had been called in to assess the situation. What he'd discovered was that the creature wasn't becoming more aggressive. It was becoming more intelligent, apparently learning from its interactions with the research staff and developing problem-solving capabilities that exceeded their initial behavioral assessments. The Void Stalker wasn't trying to escape, Marcus explained, turning away from the current demonstration to face his professor. It was trying to show the research team a more efficient way to maintain their equipment. Void Stalkers are natural engineers. They have to be to survive in the kind of environments they evolved in. When it saw the researchers struggling with power distribution problems, its instincts were to help fix the issue. And the plasma worm incident? Marcus grinned, remembering the panic that had erupted when the facility's most dangerous thermal-based predator had begun generating unprecedented heat patterns. Same thing, essentially. The plasma worm wasn't becoming more dangerous. It was trying to demonstrate advanced metallurgy techniques. Apparently, its species uses controlled plasma manipulation for manufacturing as well as hunting. When it realized that the research facility was interested in its thermal capabilities, it started showing off. Professor Kelthera shook her head in amazement. In 6 months, you've helped reclassify 17 different species from dangerous predator to potential research partner. The xenobiology department's entire theoretical framework has been turned upside down. Maybe, Marcus said thoughtfully, our theoretical framework was the problem in the first place. I think we've been looking at intelligence and cooperation through a really narrow lens. Just because something is dangerous doesn't mean it's hostile. And just because something is different doesn't mean it can't be a friend. Their conversation was interrupted by an alert from the station's communication system. Admiral Korax's voice came through the speakers with the crisp efficiency of military urgency. All senior staff to the Strategic Command Center immediately. We have a developing situation that requires immediate attention. Marcus and Professor Kelthera exchanged glances before hurrying through the station's corridors toward the command center. Along the way, they passed several of Marcus's former classmates from the xenobiology program, each of whom had found their career prospect dramatically expanded by the new approaches to interspecies relations that had developed following the Ambassador Zero incident. The Strategic Command Center was buzzing with activity when they arrived. Admiral Korax stood at the center of a complex tactical display that showed the outer reaches of the galactic rim, where long-range sensor arrays monitored for threats from deep space. Director Synthesis was present via quantum link from the Christek homeworld, their crystalline form shimmering with data processing patterns that indicated intense analysis. What's the situation, Admiral? Professor Kelthera asked. Long-range sensors have detected a massive energy signature approaching from intergalactic space, Admiral Korax replied, gesturing to the tactical display. The signature is unlike anything in our databases, but the energy output levels are comparable to Ambassador Zero's maximum recorded capabilities. Marcus felt a familiar thrill of excitement, mixed with anticipation. Another entity like Ambassador Zero? Possibly, Director Synthesis replied, their translated voice carrying notes of concern. But the approach vector and energy patterns are significantly different. This entity appears to be moving with clear purpose toward inhabited systems, and its energy output is increasing rather than decreasing as it approaches. Admiral Korax highlighted specific elements of the display. Based on current trajectory and acceleration patterns, the entity will reach the outer colonies in approximately 72 hours. We need to determine its intentions and establish communication before it enters inhabited space. Has Ambassador Zero been informed of the situation? Marcus asked. We're bringing Ambassador Zero online now, Dr. Vorthak announced from his position at the communication control station. The familiar energy patterns that indicated Ambassador Zero's active communication state began to appear on the monitoring displays. Admiral Korax, Ambassador Zero's translated voice came through the communication system. I have been observing the approaching entity. It is one of my kind, but not one that I recognize. Its communication patterns suggest significant distress or urgency. Can you establish communication with it? Professor Kelthra asked. I am attempting to do so, but the entity does not appear to be responding to standard deep space communication protocols. Its energy patterns suggest that it is either unable or unwilling to slow its approach for communication. Marcus studied the tactical display, noting the entity's trajectory and the steadily increasing energy output. Something about the pattern seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place what it reminded him of. Ambassador Zero, he said, what would cause one of your kind to approach inhabited space at maximum speed without responding to communication attempts? The pause that followed was longer than usual, and when Ambassador Zero responded, its translated voice carried tones that Marcus had never heard before. Uncertainty mixed with something that might have been fear. There are few possibilities, Marcus. The entity might be fleeing from something in the deep spaces between galaxies. It might be seeking urgent assistance that cannot wait for normal diplomatic protocols. Or it might be carrying a warning about threats that require immediate action. What kind of threats? Admiral Corax asked. The kind that consume galaxies, Admiral. The kind that my people were created to guard against. The weight of this statement settled over the command center like a cold blanket. The idea that there were threats that could endanger entire galaxies was almost too vast to comprehend. How do we proceed? Director Synthesis asked. Marcus was studying the energy patterns more carefully now, noting the way they fluctuated and intensified in regular cycles. I think I need to try direct communication, he announced. If this entity is fleeing from something or carrying an urgent warning, we can't wait for normal first contact protocols. Absolutely not, Admiral Corax said immediately. The risks of attempting communication with an unknown entity of this power level are unacceptable. With respect, Admiral, Marcus replied, the risks of not attempting communication might be worse. If Ambassador Zero is right about galaxy-level threats, we need to know what we're dealing with. Professor Kelthra was reviewing the sensor data on a secondary display. Marcus might be right, Admiral. The entity's energy patterns are becoming increasingly erratic as it approaches inhabited space. If it's carrying a warning, we may not have time for extended preparation. I can provide a communication interface, Ambassador Zero offered. If Marcus is willing to attempt contact, I can establish a relay that would allow safe interaction with the approaching entity. Admiral Corax was silent for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential consequences of inaction. Finally, he spoke with the measured tones of a commander making a decision that could affect galactic history. Mr. Chun, you are authorized to attempt communication with the unknown entity under maximum security protocols. Ambassador Zero, please establish the safest possible communication interface. The next hour was spent preparing for what might be the most important communication attempt in galactic history. The Deep Space Communication Wing's most advanced systems were reconfigured to handle the unprecedented energy levels involved, while fleet squadrons throughout the rim sectors were placed on high alert. When the communication interface finally activated, Marcus found himself in contact with an entity whose desperation was immediately apparent even across the vast distances of space. Can anyone hear me? The entity's translated voice carried tones of exhaustion and urgent fear. I'm seeking the beings who befriended the Guardian, called Zero. I carry warnings that cannot wait. We can't hear you, Marcus replied, his voice calm despite the magnitude of the situation. I'm Marcus, and Ambassador Zero is here with me. What's your warning? The Devourers have awakened. The entity replied, its energy patterns fluctuating with what appeared to be barely controlled panic. The ancient enemies of all ordered reality have begun moving between galaxies. They consume light itself, turning stars cold and empty, unmaking everything they encounter. My people's barriers in the deep spaces have failed. The Devourers are coming here. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of galactic civilization suddenly, realizing that it faced threats beyond imagination. Ambassador Zero's energy patterns shifted to configurations that Marcus had never seen before, patterns that suggested preparation for war. How long do we have? Admiral Corax asked. Perhaps 1 of your years, perhaps less. The Devourers move slowly between galaxies, but once they arrive, they spread quickly. We need to prepare defenses, gather all available Guardians, and perhaps most importantly, we need to understand why the beings of this galaxy are different from others the Devourers have consumed. Different how? Professor Kelthra asked. Other galaxies fled or fought or died when the Devourers came. But Your people befriend what they do not understand. Your people make allies of entities that other species fear. If there is any hope of stopping the devourers, it lies in your ability to find cooperation where others find only conflict. Marcus realized that humanity's strange approach to fear and danger might be more than just an interesting psychological quirk. It might be the galaxy's best hope for survival against a threat that had destroyed countless other civilizations. "Then we'd better get started," he said, his voice carrying the kind of determination that Professor Kelthra had learned to associate with humans facing the impossible. "We've got a galaxy to save, and apparently the best way to do that is to make friends with everything that scares everyone else." As emergency protocols activated throughout galactic space, and the greatest mobilization in recorded history began, Marcus Chun stood ready to attempt the most audacious friendship campaign ever conceived, convincing an entire galaxy's worth of dangerous entities.